We're going to Esther chapter 9 together. Esther chapter 9 is where we're going. We're on a new lesson, lesson number 7 of this series. There's just 2 left. 2 lessons. I'm sure it'll be a few weeks, probably take us close towards the end of the year, 5 or 6 weeks probably left here together. And if you take a quick look at your Bible, you'll see that Esther chapter 9 is quite a large chapter. And then you'll see Esther chapter 10 is not a very large chapter. So you have 32 verses in Esther 9, and then there's just 3 verses in chapter 10. But we're going to start into chapter 9 together tonight. I trust understand what is happening, because you've passed at this point, if you've been with us through this series on God's Got This, we've passed the major climax of the book. If anything, you've kind of passed the major threat zone of the fact that the Jewish people were going to be exterminated. We're kind of in the middle of this reality of kind of dealing with the situation, but God has already turned the tides of the favor of God's people within this nation. And kind of in chapter 9, you see how everything fleshes out. You see the details of how God's victory comes to pass for the Jewish people. And so what I'm going to try and do as we start into this is try and see that transition. And you see the title of the lesson is there, From Mourning to a Good Day. All right? Understand, sometimes going from one side to the other side is not instantaneous. All of us, when we're going through real intense difficulty in life, sometimes things do not change in a moment. I mean, sometimes everything can change in a phone call, but the transition from heartache to a transition to victory often is a process. There's so many steps involved in that journey. And for the nation of Israel, they at one moment are headed towards extinction, and in one moment, one feast where Esther is sitting down with the king and with Haman, in one moment everything changes. The trajectory moves from absolute terror to victory, but that victory is not done in a moment. It really transitions through a period. So chapter number 9, when you're looking at it, is how God allows this victory to come to pass. What all transitions from this morning, from this absolute destruction, from this terror for the Jewish people, to a good day. Remembering that the big view of this book is how God providentially kept alive the nation of Israel. That's what God wants these people to see. It is really the celebration that the Jewish people were headed towards great calamity, and how God worked through these situations to bring to pass a victory for his people. So let's do this to start. I'm going to start reading Esther chapter 9. I'll probably just read the first 3 verses, and then we'll take a moment to pray and get into the beginning of this lesson. I trust to understand the direction of where we're going. Esther chapter 9, verse number 1. Now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put in execution, in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them. The Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to lay hand on such as sought their hurt. And no man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell upon all people. And all the rulers of the provinces and the lieutenants and the deputies and the officers of the king helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. Let's pray, ask for God's help tonight. God, thank you so much that we can be here. Thank you that you are a God who turns the tide. That although there are moments in our lives of great terror, of great fear, sometimes where we don't know what the next day may hold, that we serve a God that changes the direction, changes the current. And you show us how things play out. And I pray, Lord, as we look tonight at the Jewish people, that we'd be reminded of your great power, your great control over history, that we'd put our faith and confidence in you to work out the details of our lives as well. Help us tonight, we pray, in Jesus' name, amen. So the big announcement has happened. God's people are going to be saved. Chapter 9 answers the how. How is this going to happen? Everything obviously looks better. Haman, the one who has sought their hurt, Haman has been destroyed. But then there's this complicated situation in which two laws are kind of taking effect the same day. One decree was for the decree of the Jews' extermination, that anyone had free reign, if they wanted to go ahead and kill any Jew without reprisal. Another law has now been put into effect at the same time, for the same day, that Mordecai, now that he's under leadership, another law is going out that the Jews can gather together like an army to defend themselves against anyone who wants to do them hurt. This day is going to be interesting, isn't it? Can you imagine having a day in Hamilton where it's like anybody that wants to kill the people that they don't like can do it, and you don't have to go to jail? Kind of scary, wouldn't it? You're like, man, I don't know. I think that day I'm just going to go inside my house, close my windows, shut. I don't want to know what's going to happen. I want to be part of what's going to happen. But can you imagine the uniqueness and the fear that would have been for many different people? There was obviously within this passage, there was people that desired the Jews hurt, that wanted them dead, that wanted them exterminated, that although Haman had lost his power, he was not the only one that had intense feelings against the Jews. There were also those Jewish people who wanted their own protection. And so you have this day eventually comes. In the last chapter, what's been set in motion is the king has said you can protect yourself. You can, as Mordecai has sent out through all of these provinces. Remember the 127 or whatever it was provinces where all of the Babylonian rule extended. This is coming to effect this day. What is this day going to look like? I think it's helpful to understand this chapter to look back at verse number 1. Because at the very end of that verse, it tells us something that I think will help us introduce this concept when it says, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them. There was a very intense hatred of the Jewish people that is even in existence underneath Ahasuerus' rule. There are people that intensely and greatly hate the Jews, want nothing to do with them. Of course, you don't have to look far to still see anti-Semitism today. I think in a very unique way, we've seen that over the last year, rising again. But it is something that has risen and fallen during different times in human history. For me as a Christian, all right, to me it looks so much in the different involvement of that there's a current behind it, of course, that the devil would love to see the Jewish people destroyed, because God still has so much that he has promised and prophesied with those people. Some unique stats that I read, and most of these are from the States, but I want to share you a few things in just a minute from our country, specifically Ontario as well. But the amount of people that are Jews that would rather people not know that they're Jews. The stats that I'm reading here, 22% refrain from publicly wearing or carrying or displaying any item that might make others able to identify them as Jewish. Different people. This statistic, I think, is in our notes. More than half, 52% of those between the ages of 18 and 29, saying they had taken steps to conceal their Jewishness, which is interesting. Of course, as you see the rise of the change in ages, and of course, I think these dates were from 2021, but interesting to see how many people want to not be known as Jews because of the pressure that is still alive and part of today. I want to show you a few things because for some of us, I can think of myself, I was born in the early 1980s. A lot of some of even what would have happened pre-World War II, many of us did not experience. And we think sometimes of anti-Semitism as being just maybe an issue that was over in Europe, and maybe not recognizing that it might have been much closer to home. And it did not take me long today on a quick Google search to look up anti-Semitism in Canada to come across some things that actually were very startling to me. So let me share some of these with you. These were from the late 1930s in Ontario that shows anti-Semitism alive and well, sadly, even in this province. And I'm not sure which picture they're going to put up first, but this one is from 1938. And this is an ad from Ontario. You can see probably right across the top where it says in quotes, "We are not Jewish." Late 1930s. And this is from Ontario. This was an ad that happened, and I can't remember the city, but if you'd like to see the article that I was looking at today, that was one. Other ones from the late 1930s where it says, "No Jews wanted." And this would have been less than 2 hours away, actually, from this location where this sign would have been, late 1938. I think there's one other one I wanted to show you here as well. Entrance, Forest Hill Lodge, and it says they're Gentiles only, right? And we kind of think of everything that rose into the 1940s, of course, with the Second World War, as being mainly a Europe problem. But obviously, we can see anti-Semitism as something, sadly, that has been a big part of human history. Now, I'm showing you that because I think to understand everything that happens in chapter 9 and the great conflict between, even in this moment, people who were Jewish and people that were non-Jewish, it's very helpful to understand that, as verse says, there was people that hated the Jews. Yes?
Turned away a ship called the Exodus, which was full of Jews. He had an extreme hatred for the Jews.
Okay.
The Prime Minister of Canada.
I remember that happening at one point, and I forget that there was quite a few different countries that they got turned away from. Isn't that the one? Is that the same one I'm thinking of? Yeah. Yeah. Let me read you a few things here. Hopefully this will help. Anti-Semitism in Ontario has taken many forms over the last century and a half, from anti-Semitic cartoons and commentaries to the popular press. It was particularly noticeable in Ontario's accommodation and employment practices in the early to mid-20th century. It's hard to imagine today walking into a restaurant or hotel and being greeted with a sign saying "No Jews allowed" or "Gentiles only." But many restaurants, shops, golf clubs, and resorts would only serve non-Jewish clientele. And signs like these were found on many beaches around the province as well. This exclusionary practice led some of the community to establish their own clubs and resorts, such as the Primrose Club in Toronto, that would cater to Jewish patrons not welcome elsewhere. It's interesting to look historically, and sad to look historically, at the reality of anti-Semitism very close to home. And you see this taking place all over the world at all different times. And it's important for us to recognize that as we see this incredible conflict, really, that chapter 9 highlights, that we understand that very clearly there were people like Haman that wanted the Jewish people exterminated, that wanted people killed. And the threat, the very real threat to the lives of people, and the very real pressure that was being dealt with. If we go back to our notes, we'll see here at the beginning of verse number 1 that it says it's in the month Adar. We found it very helpful as part of this, these slides, very helpful calendar that shows, and if you'd like to have this, I know every time I read the Old Testament, I come sometimes across a month of the Jewish calendar. This very helpfully lays out where this would have landed along the other months that we often, of course, work with ourselves. So late February, early March is the month Adar. And so this became, all right, what we're going to commonly see within the Old Testament as the Feast of Purim, or Purim, right? And so this was all part of their celebration that eventually, towards the end of this chapter, we're going to see. But you're going to see this very strong reality of anti-Semitism that is really fueling a great conflict that is taking part in chapter 9. So many people, sadly, that wanted the Jewish people destroyed. Haman was not the only one that wanted to see this take place. He was really the spokesperson, most likely, for many others who are pushing for a very similar agenda. This happened throughout the Bible many times. It's one of the reasons, as of course the Bible tells us, that those who bless Israel will be blessed, those that curse Israel will be cursed. But we know that we are still dealing with that, even within our generation and our time period. I want to go back to Esther chapter 8 and verse 11, just so that we can see what is happening, because this is really the end of this chapter that I mentioned. It says in verse 11, when the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and take the spoil of them for a prey. So this is what is granted by the king. You can kill basically anyone, okay? And you can take their stuff. That was what was granted the Jewish people. Now, I'm showing you that because that is not what the Jewish people are going to do. But they were given that limit of authority by the king in order to protect themselves. So something of very real threat, of course, is happening. I'm going to go now to Esther chapter 9, read verses 3 and 4. And we're just going to skip here into our lesson over those pictures from the Second World War. But just showing the transition is the idea from a time of great pain to a time of great joy. But Esther 9, verses 3 and 4, it says, "And all the rulers of the provinces and the lieutenants and the deputies and the officers of the king helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater." So there's been a massive change in authority. All right, there's been authority change from a man Haman, and that wanted the Jews exterminated, to, of course, Mordecai, who is a Jew who wants the Jews preserved. But however, underneath the change of leadership, there is still two great currents, we could even say political currents, that are taking place within this nation that want to go very different directions. And although there's been a massive change of leadership, there is still major conflict in the people. So when this day comes, okay, there's people that are set on a warpath. They are ready for this day. They have armed themselves both mentally and physically to take whatever vengeance that they desire to take against one another. It's going to be a bloody day. It's going to be a brutal day. But it's a day that the Bible wants us to see that goes from mourning to gladness. Let me ask this question, and then maybe we'll get hopefully a little bit better into our lesson. Why do you think, okay, as we deal, I mentioned the fact that I think part of what the Jews deal with as anti-Semitism is really a spiritual battle at its root. But what are some of the reasons that sometimes come up in society that people have anti-Semitism or issues specifically with the Jewish people? What have you heard? What have you dealt with? All right, Larry?
The war that's going on in Afghanistan.
Okay, the war going on in Afghanistan, of course, or in Israel and Gaza. All right, it's huge right now. Different people taking different sides on different perspectives. What else? Why do people have, and I think it's, of course, one of the big reasons we're dealing with it right now. We've had even things put on the church building, of people with strong feelings on that regard. What else? What are some of the reasons? What are some of the things you hear from time to time? Yes, Austin.
Because some Jewish people live differently, and I think sometimes they face persecution for that as well.
Yes, yeah, and that's one of the things sometimes even in cartoons or things are exaggerated. Yep, physical appearance. What else? What are some of the reasons that sometimes, where it's like, I don't want to say it. I think it's part of it, and I appreciate the feeling. I think it's good. Glenn?
I think throughout history, God has blessed a lot of Jewish people with a lot of money, and people look at it jealously and say, I wish I could be like them,
Sure.
so therefore I'm going to hate them.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think God has definitely blessed the Jewish people. I think the Jewish people have also practiced biblical money managing practices, which has really helped them. And God gives some wonderful truths that help with money management. But yeah, there is this thing within society that when someone has something that you don't, that we feel like I should get it. And there's people that just take that feeling of ownership. God calls it covetousness. But when someone's not a Christian, they just feel like, well, I should get what they have, right? Go ahead, Brother Doug.
Yeah, there's also different sects of Jews, like they have the Zionist movement and different things like that, which some people maybe would think that the whole nation is all that type of, aggressiveness or
Sure.
what have you.
Yeah. And we have to be careful with that.
Generalizations.
Yes, yeah. In every group there are extremists, right? And it's very easy for us when we want to prove a point of taking one extreme person and painting a whole group with that color. And that's very dangerous. But yes, you do see that happening with the Jewish people as well. Yes?
Jews are God's chosen people.
Yeah, and I personally feel at the very root of everything, there's a spiritual battle that is taking place there. Some of these things, some things that come up to me are sometimes almost more excuses than actual realities. But that spiritual battle of the perception of people, and we're seeing it very clearly, of course, right now, and seeing that happen. Anything else? All right, yes, Michael.
Even seeing Christians that twist the scriptures and use that to justify anti-Semitism.
Yes. Yeah, I've seen that as well. And depending on your theology, some people's theology makes a lot of room for a hatred of the Jewish people. And that's sad. That's sad. But it is true. Sometimes people want to make something, even that's not scripturally there. But what I want us to see with the lesson, with the time that we have tonight, is that although God gives freedom, that sometimes there's a painful process to get there. I think it's good for us to recognize this in general tonight. We're going to be celebrating November 11th, the fact that there's many who gave their lives for our freedom. But even when freedom happens, it's not instantaneous, it's not easy. I think if anything, this passage paints the reality that although God gave freedom, it was a brutal process. And sometimes people want to find or even they want to get to a place of victory without any pain, without any difficulty. And sometimes people hope for the same thing when it comes to life. You know, even when I read this passage, it makes my mind consider, not that we'll have a lot of time to discuss this necessarily tonight, but for those who have never gone through war, never suffered through the difficulty of World War II, we want to solve everything today, with just kind words, and hopefully, all the bad people will just do what's right if you say enough nice things to them. But that's not what you see here. Sadly, in Esther chapter 9, you see people that had to stand for their lives, the brutality of what they had to endure, people that sadly did have to die. And in this situation, great conflict came with great brutality. So see, number one, if you've got your notes there with you, number one is the protection of the Jews, the protection of the Jews. And the overarching of the lesson is this process is what happened when Esther stood. When Esther takes her stand, when she does what is difficult, when she starts the ball rolling in the process with the king, what happens? And the first thing is that the Jews were protected. And I don't mean that that was easy, and it wasn't instantaneous. Recognize there's a lot of things that God gives in life that are not easy and are not instantaneous. And I see sometimes people in their spiritual development, on another hand, they see that God has promised something good, but they hope that that means that it will just be easy and without effort. Now, God opened the door for the Jews to be saved, but sadly there was a lot of personal effort and even, I would say, brutality that happened in order for them to be saved and rescued. And I want you to see within this lesson that God portrays the reality that God opened the door, that God gave rescue, but that was still very brutal through this process. Larry, do you have a question?
God wanted to test the Jews in that period of time if they were going to do something on their own or whether they were going to wait for God to move.
Yeah, that's possible. And some of these things, God doesn't tell us all of God's reasons and all of what God was doing. But we do see the fact that God opened the door, but there was still human responsibility and there was still human effort. And I think that's an important combination for us to see. I've heard people say, and I've heard you've heard a similar expression, pray like everything depends on God and work like everything depends on you. And God, in many things within the Christian experience, within serving God, requires both the reality that we lean on God for what we cannot do, but God's still giving us human responsibility. And in this situation, God turned the tide. God made it possible for them to be protected. But when the day came, they could not just sit and hope everything would be okay. They had to gather, they had to arm themselves, and sadly even had to fight in this situation because there was people that wanted them killed. Letter A there in your notes is the king's favor. the king's favor. And I want you to see that at the end of the first day, we're going to kind of walk through a little bit of the first day, when this kind of comes to a climax, when people are legally allowed to kill one another without reprisal. I want you to see how the king responded. We've read verses 3 and 4. Mordecai is in charge. Verse 5, thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, and did what they would unto those that hated them. All right, these people with great hatred, the Jews are able to turn and defend themselves and defeat those doing that. Notice verse 6, and in Shushan, the palace, all right, so this is right within the immediate city, the Jews slew and destroyed 500 men. And then it lists in verses 7, 8, and 9 different cities where similar things are happening. The Jews are getting great victory. Verse number 10, and 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, slew they. But notice this, but on the spoil laid they not their hand. Now that happens in verse number 10, but also look down at verse number 15. For the Jews that were in Shushan gathered themselves together on the 14th day also of the month Adar, and slew 300 men at Shushan. But on the prey they laid not their hand. Verse 16. But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together and stood for their lives, and had rest from their enemies, and slew of their foes 75,000. But they laid not their hands on the prey. Now, why is the Bible including? This is good for you to think through for a minute. Why is the Bible including in this passage that in this time the Jews did not take the prey of these people that hated them, that wanted them killed? Why would the Bible include that? All right, Larry. Okay, could be for some different reasons. I think it's good for us to think through, what does it communicate when you're in a situation and someone offers you money and you say, I don't want it? Yes?
They weren't doing this for gain. They were doing it to protect themselves.
Okay, all right, Glenn?
Yeah, what Austin said, it was self-defense. It wasn't, they weren't on the offensive. They weren't pillaging these people. They were trying to save their own lives.
Yeah, when you don't take money, when the Bible's listing that, it is showing, what is this about? Is this about the fact that the Jews are like, all right, giddy up. I've got a list of 20 people that don't like me, and I'd love to get all their stuff. I'm going to go through my list starting first thing in the morning, and I am going to fill the coffers. Is that what it's about? No, it was about the fact that there was people out there that very fiercely and very strongly hated them. And in this situation, it's like the principle that is driving behind this is self-preservation and protection, not financial gain. And recognizing that after the first day happens, and why I'm trying to address this, the first time this happens, after this goes through, look at verse number 12, and the king said unto Esther the queen, the Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the palace. Now that's big. Stop with me for a minute. If we found out tomorrow that 500 people in Hamilton got killed, I'm not talking about one murder, okay, although this wasn't murder, but if I found one person or 5 people died, if we found 5 people died in a fire, that would be news everywhere. If we found out 500 people died, it would stop everything. I mean, everyone would be talking about that. Would be everything that was going on. And after this transpires, the king comes to Esther and says, hey, this is what has happened. Let alone, look partway through the verse, and the 10 sons of Haman, what have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? He doesn't even know yet how many other people have died in other places. These are his subjects. But look what he says, now what is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. Or what is thy request further? And it shall be done. The Jews are handling things in such a way that the king comes and says, hey, is that enough? Is that enough? Look what Esther responds, verse 13. And Esther said, if it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which were in Shushan to do tomorrow according to unto this day's decree. And let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. This is letter B, the queen's final request. Now, the Jews are dealing with things in such a way that it moves the king to still allow, hey, is this enough? And Esther comes to the king and says, for whatever reason, there was still conflict that was going on, as she perceives and as Mordecai are seeing. From what I understand of this passage, this is right immediately within the king city of Shushan. This is right immediately with what they can see and observe. And she says, can we within Shushan have one more day? One more day. If there's anyone out there that wants to kill the Jews, let them come. One more day that if there's anyone that has proclaimed hatred against the Jews, that the Jews can deal with. One more day to send a message. And can you imagine the king in this moment saying, okay? Because he is seeing, from what I understand at this moment, he is seeing by this point, okay, there is major issue with the Jewish people within my immediate city. He sees the eruption of bloodshed. He sees all the people that want to take the lives of Jewish people, and he sees the things that are happening, and he says, I will give one more day. And look at the end of that verse. And let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. Now that's brutal. Right? They're already dead. That happened back in verse number 10. That happened already. They already died. But Esther is like, can we send a message within this city that Jewish people are not to be killed and harmed? And we understand the society of this day is much more brutal than the society of our day, but I'm saying this sends a very clear message to that entire city. Hey, things have changed. Haman wanted all the Jewish people dead. The Jewish people were not killed. Those that hate the Jews are going to die, and those that are going to push the agenda under Haman's descendants to want to do that thing, they're going to be public display of brutal end to their life. I'm trying to show this reality. God turned the tide, but it was brutal. It was ugly. It was nasty. And sometimes we want lives that are just sunshine and rainbows. I want everything to work out perfect according to my story. I mean, this is what I'm dreaming my life to be. And when God works it out, it's just going to be easy. So many people I've met that are looking for the easy Christian life, just that everything's going to fall in place exactly the way that we hoped it. When God gives victory, it's going to be perfectly the way that I wanted it to be. I would have skipped chapter 9 if it was my choice. Honestly, I'd have been like, you know what? Just leave it at chapter 8. Let's just, everybody be happy, everybody be peaceful, everybody love everybody. That would have been great, but that is not the world we live in, and that is not life sometimes. Sadly, there are some days of incredible conflict where God gives victory. Sometimes there's brutality in which when people want one another dead, that at times conflict has to happen. Notice the quote by Warren Wiersbe. I'll read it and then try and finish up our lesson here tonight. But it says, since the Jews were not aggressors, it means that the 10 sons of Haman had taken up arms and attacked the Jews. And all 10 of them were slain. The bodies of the 10 sons were hanged on Haman's gallows as a warning to the enemy. The sight of the 10 corpses on Haman's gallows would certainly deter the Persians from attacking the Jews and would result in the saving of lives. It's brutal, it's awful, but it definitely put to rest any future conflict over this issue. Letter C, the last blank there from the lesson tonight. Letter C is the Jews preserved. The Jews preserved. God kept them. Verse 16, but the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together and stood for their lives and had rest from their enemies and slew of their foes. And just let this sink in. 75,000, but they laid not their hands on the prey. 75,000 people. that were in such hatred against the Jewish people that came to a point of conflict that the Jewish people defeated and destroyed within those provinces. This is a staggering number. When I was growing up, Moncton was around 80,000. And the city that was probably closest to me, I think it's somewhere around 130 or 150 now. But I think of the amount of people that happened throughout this entire region. What does that show us? Did God give victory? Absolutely. Was it pretty? Absolutely not. Did God give opportunities so the Jews were not eradicated? Yes, he did. But was everything easy and sunshine and simple and straightforward? Sadly, no. And sadly, sometimes, although all of us would love a society and a world in which things always go easy and everyone wants to be peaceful, none of us have ever experienced war in this room that I know of. None of us have had to see the brutality of sometimes evil people having to be stopped. But in this society, in this situation, there was people that hated the Jews so desperately that Haman put a plan together that I'm going to eradicate an entire nation. I'm going to kill everyone. And people were on board to such an extreme degree. Anti-Semitism was so real and so alive that when the day came, people went to war over whether or not the Jews would be allowed to live another day. And God granted victory. God granted the Jews their preservation and to keep their lives. But it was a brutal end. It was a difficult story. It was a terrible day. But it was a day that went from mourning to celebration. And I just want us to recognize this, that when it comes to our life with God, I think sometimes we hope that every day when God is in it will be easy. Every day will just be a perfectly wrapped victory at which everything is simple, there is no challenge, there is no difficulty. The truth is, some days, even when God is at work, some days are brutal. Some days are awful. But God still paves a path through as to which God gets his people to the other side. The entirety of the story of Esther, to me, is a story about God providentially keeping his people alive when the reality was there was a man that desperately wanted them dead. But God is in control. God is able to protect his people.